Ladies and gentlemen, coming up in just a moment, Bob Greaves, the man you see before you right now, is going to give advice to preachers. But are they ready to listen? There's only one way to find out, and that is to ask them one by one. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy. Stay tuned.
Well, good evening, and it's great to be back with you again. I just spent a really delightful hour with Greg Bray, just a wonderful individual. I really appreciate the conversations he and I can have, and boy, I tell you, I wish he lived closer to me. He's out there in Wisconsin. I'm over here in New York, in the Binghamton area, and boy, I just love to have him over for a cookout sometime. We could sit around and just chit chat that way. If he ever gets out this way, that'd be awesome. Maybe if I get out that way. I was going to be out his way, in fact, but there was an event that was canceled that I was asked to speak at, but they were unable to raise enough interest and funds in the event, and so the event ended up being canceled. And going to be out there. Even other speakers like N.T. Wright were going to be there, and which I thought was going to be interesting because I don't find myself really too much in agreement with some of the things he says. Anyhow, here we are. My name is Bob Greaves, as he told you, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor, which is the name of this show. And tonight it's something I've been doing here lately, and I usually avoid this. I've been talking in the last several shows using certain biblical texts as the springboard for what I'm talking about. And that's something that I don't often do. And the reason I don't often do that is because I really feel that oftentimes that is done in a very inappropriate manner. I think that a lot of the so-called biblical messages are often used in a way that I feel misrepresents the real nature of the biblical text and in many ways the actual message of it. You've heard me say this before, that so let me just kind of reiterate this. A lot of people don't realize it, but the New Testament itself was actually written in a dialect called Koine Greek. You may not know this, but Koine Greek was a very dialected language where there were so many different dialects of Greek. And in fact, there were so many dialects that were so different from each other that they were provincial dialects. There were people in some areas of Greece during the early history of that country who lived in one province and other people who lived in another province of Greece. And although they both spoke Greek, their dialects were so different they couldn't talk to each other in their native tongue. One of the more influential dialects of Greek was Attic Greek. And as a result, most of the country spoke Attic Greek as kind of like a second language. And it was the language of the academics. It was kind of like a very formalized, and it was one of the more prestigious, as it were, languages. But the people in their various different provinces tended to natively speak the dialect that belonged there. This kind of thing doesn't happen in the world today that much, except in many underdeveloped countries. It would be kind of like if New Yorkers spoke kind of English, and some might argue that they do, that people in New Jersey couldn't understand, et cetera. I do remember when I first went down to Bob Jones University, I went into an LB's restaurant to order some lunch, And no matter what I said, I ended up having to point at the menu because the waitress really couldn't understand me. And she was saying things like, I can't understand you. You're just a fast talking northerner. And, and she couldn't. I could not order the lunch. It was weird. But it's not quite that bad in America. But at a time, it was that difficult in Greece. And so um, most of the people spoke the kind of the national language of Attic Greek as a second language. They spoke their own provincial dialect as their own native tongue. This was quite fractured, but because they had the national language as well, it did allow them to operate and function as a country in a very efficient way. And when Alexander the Great sought to conquer so much of the known world during his day, he knew that it was essential to have communication between him and conquered peoples. And so, as a result of this, eventually the Greek Empire works it out where Attic Greek is kind of dumbed down and brought to a far more simplistic form. And that it is this which is taught by the armies and various delegates to the conquered people. And this was a dialect of Greek called Koine. Now, Koine Greek was a second language for everybody who spoke it. Nobody spoke Koine Greek as their native tongue. It was a secondary language. If there were anybody, it would be a rare case. But it also helped that, no doubt, that in a very barbaric and conquering nation, that you could learn this secondary language more efficiently, because the fact was that if you were to be approached by a soldier who was speaking to you in Koine and you couldn't talk back, there could be serious consequences. So there was a great deal of motivation to make sure you could speak this as at least a second language sufficiently. But it was, for all people who spoke it, a secondary language, and it was a dumbed down subset of Attic and based upon Attic Greek. However, something that is true of all languages and all dialects, that once they're established, they continue to move on and develop with a life of their own. And Koine was no different. It even developed into various different regional differences. Enough regional differences that some copies of the New Testament that we have where the words are different, these aren't actual errors. These or mistranscriptions of the original text. They were rather regional transcriptions where a word which was used in the original actually possessed a slightly different set of nuances and a different domain of meaning in a different region. And so when the New Testament came, some of the New Testament documents got to that other area, since the dialect of Koine there was in some ways a little regionally different, sometimes these words would be alternated with other words that were more regionally similar to the original intent of the word used in, say, the autograph of the original document. Anyhow, not that I want to bore you with a lot of this linguistic detail. It's important to recognize something, though. Two things here. Number one, Koine Greek was a secondary language, and we know a lot about how human beings use secondary languages. They don't use them the way that that language would be used if it was a native language. That's one thing we know about him, and we know a lot about that. I'm not going to go into all those details now. But the other thing that is important to know is this, that Koine eventually died out. By about the year 330 AD, nobody's speaking it anymore. In fact, they're not reading it. And a lot of the documents that already existed in Koine Greek that were considered important were being copied. But it even got to the point where the people copying these documents to preserve them couldn't read them. They could read the letters and they could make the copies, but they didn't comprehend what they were reading because it was not a language that was in use. And the language as used even in Greece had dialectically evolved itself to the point where it wasn't similar enough even there, so that even the modern Greek speakers of that day, although they'd recognize a lot of the words and could probably capture some of the gist, the real clarity of the nuances of the words as they would have been originally understood by people who were familiar with Koine Greek was pretty much lost. And the church turned to Latin as its primary language, and various different Latin versions were brought about until finally the Latin Vulgate, as we know it, became the authorized church version that they used, and they used that for a long, long time. And the truth is that Koine Greek was something that was pretty much ignored, even in the Christian community, for about 1,000 years. And by the time they started to go back to the Greek, they couldn't read it, and they weren't sure what to make of it. It wasn't modern Greek. It wasn't like Attic Greek. There are some similarities. There are some problems, but they didn't know what it was, and there hadn't been enough real history that was preserved from the ancient days for them to even put it into a context, because they'd pretty much learned to ignore all that in the progressiveness of what had become the institutionalized religion of Christianity. So they didn't know what it was, and a theory was suggested that became very popular, and it remained the leading theory for almost 100 years, that the dialect of the New Testament that they had when they would read their, when they look at their Greek New Testament, the dialect there, they thought it was some Holy Ghost dialect that to the original readers was something that they somehow, like through the magic and spiritual gift of tongues, understood what it said, and that somehow this gift had been lost, and it was written in a Holy Ghost dialect of Greek. Well, what does this Holy Ghost dialect of Greek mean now that they're starting to pay attention to it 1,000 years after they had started to ignore it? Well, they rebuilt dictionaries of Koine Greek based upon church theology and their understanding of what they were able to dig out of the root words of various of Greek words they found, and translating backwards from what they understood the Latin Vulgate to actually be saying. Now, this is an extremely artificial way. They didn't know it at the time, but we now know enough about language to realize that, sorry, that isn't going to recreate for you the meaning and the nature of the actual Koine Greek. It isn't going to work. You're going to end up with something that's fabricated, synthetic, and theologically biased. And I have argued for a long time that this is the reason why when you read your Greek New Testament and when you read your modern translations of the Bible, you're reading something that is based upon a great deal of hyperbole, where everything is understood in its extreme, rigid, grammatical sense based upon just a derivation of root words, so long as we don't too much violate what we understand to be correct theology. That's just not an honest way of dealing with the biblical text. But this is what happened. And it eventually, that is what did create enough of a difference that it actually precipitated the so-called Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation was based upon an artificial and synthetic understanding of the meaning of Koine Greek. Now we have since discovered tons of Koine Greek documents, and we now know it isn't a Holy Ghost dialect. It was the common language used as the secondary language throughout the empire, as a secondary language for all of the conquered peoples, and it was even in Greece a secondary language, which, by the way, they didn't even they kind of looked down at it because they were proud of their Attic dialect. And this being based upon it and not really quite Attic was almost in some ways perceived by them as almost a mar on their national integrity and dignity. And they didn't really care for Koine Greek there. We know so much more about it. Anyhow, this is where we get our New Testaments from. An understanding of this dialect of Greek that had for 1,000 years been totally ignored by the church and then synthetically resurrected with great deal of hyperbole. This is why I think that the Bible is oftentimes translated in ways where the things it says in the New Testament are radically and extremely distorted in order to maintain what I perceive as a manipulative, controlling message that distorts the real meaning and teaching of the original authors. Not that I'm necessarily even agreeing with all of the things that they would have said, but we have a distorted, dishonest rendition of what it was they were saying, even though, let me say this about the quality of the text. The Greek New Testaments that we have today, and the one that I use more often than not is the one from the United Bible Society. Although it's in the smaller letters rather than the unctuals that the originals were written in, um, it is based upon some excellent research of the various different extant manuscripts that we have, so that the condition of the New Testament as we currently have it is really amazingly good, particularly for any of the ancient documents that we do have any manuscripts to tell us what the actual original condition was. I would say that I'd have to agree with the biblicists, even though I don't agree with them about a lot of things, that the New Testament is probably one of the most well preserved and documentably demonstrated texts that we have from all antiquity. It's amazing, the clarity that we have in the original condition of the text based upon some honest textual criticisms that we have done in examining all the various different renditions and differences that do exist among all the various different manuscripts. But we have literally, thousands and thousands and thousands of these documents and fragments from which to work from, and it's a well established thing, so that I think we can be confident that we actually have a version of the New Testament in Greek that is very, very much like its original. What we don't have, though, is a clear, concise, properly linguistically built understanding of the language itself. Instead, we're relying on an overly worked, hyperbolic view of that language as controlled and managed by believers who had a theology they were loyal to. That's not really an honest way of dealing with a document. Anyhow, so I said all that in kind of introduction. This is one of the reasons why I tend to avoid speaking from the biblical text a lot. Many times, even when I talk about things that I think of as being verified and even taught from the text of the Bible, I won't necessarily mention that or say that, because I would rather that the truth, as it is understood, is in some ways self-evident and doesn't really require any kind of authoritative claims placed upon it. It's merely perceived as very useful, simply as heard and as seen, as experienced, as considered, etc. But anyway, I was taking a look at the second letter to Timothy, and I was going through uh, chapter 3 and looking at some of the things that Paul was telling Timothy about, as he's kind of trying to guide Timothy to tell him some of the things he's going to need to know that'll help make him a better representative of the gospel as he preaches it. And he tells him this. He says, I want you to really note something very, 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 very important. Pay attention to this. There will be terrible times coming. You're going to discover this, that as you get to know people, you're going to discover that it isn't easy working with people, teaching them who Jesus is or what it's really all about. You're going to run into some real serious obstacles in various people. You're going to find that there's people who really are people who are lovers of themselves. They give so much preference to who it is they are, that this is going to be a problem and an obstacle in clarifying what it is, this message that you're bringing. There can be people who are lovers of money, the wealth, power of the money, boastful and proud, and people who are in various ways manipulative or abusive. That these are some of the things that people resort to in their attempts to cope and deal with the challenges and risks of life. And whether we even condemn this or not is not so much the point as the recognition. Let's not be gullible that this is indeed what we deal with in this world. We're dealing with people who have a great number of agendas that they feel are very necessary, that are kind of hidden. I mean, who out there says, "Oh, you can't talk to me and get through to me because you see, I love myself too much." Nobody, nobody's going to tell you that. If they do, they're they're kind of crazy, or they're crazy like a fox. Nobody's going to say, "Oh, I'm too boastful, I'm too proud," or "I'm a very abusive human being, so you're going to just have to deal with it." There are some people who might do that, but the truth is, the people who really are an obstacle in themselves because of how they love themselves, or because of how they love money, or because of how they're abusive or boastful or proud. Um, these are not people who are necessarily dealing with this on the surface. And as a result, it's not always easy to deal with these difficult people, because we're trying to deal with motives and agendas that you can't necessarily prove they have, and that is not going to be easy to deal with, and could be even risky to deal with in times. Paul even goes on to talk about what kind of people they're going to be. It says here, disobedient to their parents, disrespectful of their parents, ungrateful, with appear to have no sense of considering anything proper, special, or valuable, or holy, or whatever you might think of as like people who are unloving, people who hold grudges, uh, people who don't mind putting others down or giving others a bad name, lying about other people, uh, people who lack the ability to regulate themselves, no sense of real appropriate self-control, people who can be downright brutal, um, people who don't really have as their motive looking for the well-being of others. And they can be treacherous. They can be arbitrary. They can be just very rash. People who are going to be very stuck on themselves and conceited. We got a comment here. Let's see what we have. Love Bob's impression of the Southern woman. That was my best. It wasn't the first time I ever did one of those impressions. My mom was worried when I went. I think I probably told you guys before. My mom was worried that when I went down to a school in the South, that I would be picking up a Southern accent. So I had to call her first chance I got after settling into school, and when she got on the phone saying, "Hi, Ma, how y'all doing up there?" And she of course knew I was kidding, but it was one of her fears. I don't know why, but it was anyway. Um, Talking about Paul's advice to Timothy. He's trying to let him know that this is the world you're dealing with. You're trying to bring a message to a world that can really be healed by a message of how they are already embraced by God, already surrounded by His presence, if they would only begin to just settle into that. That this is not a message that everyone is going to respond to by saying, "Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That's just so good to know." They're going to have a lot of things that are going to get in the way of that message, and a lot of things that message would compel them to recognize as being appropriate that they don't want to do. And he's telling them about various things. I mean, he continues on talking about how these are people who are kind of lost in kind of a hedonistic, a sense of they're living for what pleases them. They're living for what they bring, what brings them pleasure, rather than what brings them value or meaning. And there's going to be people such of this, but he ends up um, that they're lovers of these things rather than lovers of God. But Paul brings this list of warnings of the kind of obstacles that are going to be in the agenda of people. He ends it with this. He says they're going to have a form of godliness, but denying its power. And when I see that at the end of his list, that's when I realize Paul isn't really talking about all the kinds of different people that Timothy's going to be dealing with, who have never heard the message of Jesus. Although there, no doubt, he will run into this with them too. Paul's actually telling him, guess what? All of these troubles you're going to find in people, this is the trouble you're going to find in all those people who claim to be religious, these people who claim to love God, the people who claim to even believe in Jesus. Oh, they'll have the form, they'll do in the outward way the anthropological identifiable markings of a person who is a Christian, if you can put it that way. But that's all there is. There is the form of it, the real essence of what the power is in being a real Christian. And I think this word power isn't really the proper word, but more the ability, the strength, the the real stability, and it's not going to be there. And he also tells them, have nothing to do with such people. Now, I don't know how hyperbolic that is. Not really sure, but I think that that it's certainly a warning that there needs to be a certain sense of caution, perhaps distance, and they need to recognize that you just can't deal with these people point blank and leave yourself vulnerable. It's just not going to work. Um, and he talks about these people. And he, remember now, he's made it clear now, he's talking about people who claim to be religious people who believe in God, who believe in Jesus. And he says this is what they're going to do. They're going to worm their way into homes and gain control over. And then the phrase here is actually gullible women, but that's a phrase that was used in Koine Greek to talk about. It was a very chauvinistic phrase, but the phrase meant this: any man who lacked the kind of leadership of manliness was perceived as being a silly woman. And so people who don't have that sense of self-direction were sometimes characterized this way through that very, gender horrible phrase, but it was part of the Koine Greek. Um, these are people that Paul is warning Timothy. They're going to worm their way into these homes, taking advantage of people who they gain control of. People who don't really think for themselves, people who don't stand up for themselves. Now, let me ask you something. As you look at the church today, do you get the impression that the church is at times, some churches more than others, filled with a variety of people who, as leaders, have wormed their ways into the lives of just the sheeple, and they're controlling them, they're manipulating them, and they're taking advantage of these people who can't stand up for themselves, who don't know how to stand up for themselves. And Paul goes on to tell Timothy, these people are not just the silly women, as it were. They're loaded down with sins and swayed by all kinds of evil desires. That is, there's people out there who uh, haven't yet figured out how to live their lives. And some of them are going to feel downright guilty about it. And they haven't figured out how to put everything into control. And these are some of the very people that these ridiculous ministers are going to be taking advantage of. They're going to take advantage of their shame, their guilt, their lack of certainty, and they're going to find a way of giving these people the control they think they need and the leadership they think is going to make their lives wonderful, just to take advantage of them. And these are the things that Paul is talking to him about. And warning him that he's going to run into these people. This is the problem he's going to have being a representative of Jesus. You're going to find there's other people out there also claiming to be representatives of Jesus and the message, but they have really other aspects in mind. They are not motivated by an honest care and concern for the people they're speaking to. No, they're not. They are, and they have this form. Oh, it looks right, but it's not. There's no real sense of stability or ability or real capacity within it. It's just devoid of the real power of Christianity or of Jesus in that sense. And he just says, these are people that are taken advantage of, where they're always learning and never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Now, I don't think that it's because they're ever learning and never. It is amazing to me how many people approach Christianity thinking that it's a set of doctrines to be learned, when it's in many. Can you imagine if you were to approach your marriage that way? If you consider your spouse a person whose psychoanalysis and whose personality profile was something you were to study and learn, you could devote yourself religiously to that pursuit. But when are you going to have a real relationship The truth of the person, the experience of the person, the authenticity of the person isn't something you're going to find in simply pursuing them as an academic object. It just isn't going to happen. And yet, this is the way religion will be perverted. This is the way it'll be distorted. It'll be turned into a creed. It'll be turned into fixed beliefs. It's going to be turned into all kinds of things that a person must adopt as a shibboleth to prove that they have orthodoxy. And they're going to be ever learning this stuff and the real truth, the real relevant stuff, the love of God, his presence, and the kind of people they're being called into, the nature, the real nature of what Jesus came to do. This is going to be totally lost on them. They're never going to come to that knowledge because they're going to be too busy being distracted by these worries and these concerns that they're being taken advantage of by these other people who, as ministers of Jesus, as it were, come in and they find this as an opportunity to be powerful, as an opportunity to sometimes even express their own lack of self-control. When you see all the scandals that happen, particularly in the more fundamentalist, the more rigid churches, the churches that are more dogmatic, these are the churches in which some of the most horrendous abuses of people can occur, and they get swept under the rug. It's not good. And Timothy is being warned by Paul that this is what's going to happen. Paul sees it coming, and he's being very honest with him about it. That's got to be very disappointing to Paul, I would imagine. Think about it. This is a man who, in many ways, did devote his life to speaking of such a gracious embrace from God, after having been a person he's sometimes characterized as the chief of sinners, a person who should have been making God angry, and he found God not angry at all, but embracing and taking him in. And Paul, in trying to teach this message of real peace and of real the availability of Christ and of his love and of this God who keeps no record of wrongs, and the wonderful chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, where we see him talking about what love is. For Paul to realize that unfortunately there are going to be those who are going to degenerate and devolve the Christian message into nothing other than this form of abuse. And after giving so much of his life to it, he needs to warn Timothy, this is what's going to happen. I want you to be ready for it and prepared for it. It's going to happen. Now, I believe that Paul has some advice as to not just that it's going to happen. He has a strategy that he wants Timothy to follow. And the strategy, before I get into that, let me just finish up and telling you a little bit about how he's describing these people. Not that they ever learning and coming to a knowledge of the truth. But, just as there were those who we read about who had opposed Moses, these teachers oppose Jesus. They really do. They oppose the truth. They're really men of depraved minds. This is exactly what many ministers really are. They really are. They're men of depraved minds. Well, they may not even realize it, but who, as far as the faith is concerned, the real faith, a real faith in God, this is something they've actually rejected. Hopefully, their folly will be clear to everyone. And it seems to me that the folly of the church is clear to those people who are not a part of it. It is amazing how clear it is to people who are not fundamentalists just how corrupt this fundamentalist movement can be. It is amazing how people who are not Catholics can see just how corrupt some of the Catholicism has been in the sale of indulgences and some of the real silly things that they teach as being something that is religiously and dogmatically true. It's obvious to everyone except those people lost in it. I hate to use the phrase, but I'm just going to use it because it was used here as part of that language, the silly women. The gullible people, the people who are, and I don't mean to put them down. I mean, life isn't easy. And sometimes we can really be easily put into a place where we're worried about what God might think of us. And we become easy prey for people who want to tell us, well, God is really pissed with you. He's really angry with you. But hey, I've got an answer for you in the blood of Jesus and in this confession and in this creed. And by becoming loyal to us and giving us your tithe and becoming all wrapped up in that other stuff. Anyhow, here's Paul's solution to Timothy. here's what he wants to tell him that he needs to do. Okay, Timothy, guess what? You know about what I've taught, and you've heard my teaching, my way of life, the purposes that I've had, the faith I have, the patience, the love, the endurance, everything I've been through, all the sufferings and the persecutions that I've been through. Timothy, you know these things and what kind of things have happened to me. Whether we were talking about Antioch or Iconium and Lystra and the persecutions that I went through, Timothy, you know about these things. Yet the Lord rescued me out of all of them. And in fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life, you got to recognize this. There's going to be some real difficulty and troubles that will come into your life as a result of it. However, even though these imposters are going to go from bad to worse, I want you to continue in what you've learned. And as for you, you continue in that. Now, remember, there are things that you learned and became convinced of, Timothy, because you know where you learned it from and how from a small child you learned of these things that came from the writings that were part of that were associated with the Temple of Israel, and that you read these things, the what we call the biblical text. You read these things, and they spoke to you, and they gave to you from infancy a sense in which you were able to recognize the safety that you had, that even you now perceive to be through Jesus Christ. Well, here's what I want you to do. I don't want you to just limit yourself to understanding this text. I want you to realize that you live in a world where a great number of things are being understood and written about by a great number of people. And I want you to realize that there's something about the spark of the image of God in all of us that actually is what compels people to write certain things that they feel will really be of benefit to others. And that some of these things that have really been of benefit to others end up being so important that back in those days when they couldn't publish books, any manuscript that was going to be published had to be hand copied and multiple copies of it and then distributed in that manner. Paul tells Timothy, I want you to recognize something. All of this literature is God breathed. It's all there. And I want you to read all of it. Don't just limit yourself to the temple writings. Go to all literature. And you'll find that if you do this, you'll discover that it's all has various usefulness. It's helpful for you to teach things. It's good for you to try to make corrections to the way things aren't right. It's helpful to help you train yourself in the right way to do things. And this way you can be properly and thoroughly equipped to do the kinds of things that are good to do. So I want you to broaden your horizon, become a well-rounded, well-read, well-educated human being. And as you do this, this will be your best defense in dealing as a minister, as a real representative of Christ. How are you going to deal with these other people who are just going from bad to worse? These people who are really not concerned about the real faith. These people who are rather interested in taking control over the gullible. These people who are really interested in worming their ways into the homes of others. And really, this entire passage here from 2 Timothy chapter 3 is in many ways translated these days to turn it into the actual tool of those who would want to take advantage of the gullible, even in the way that it's mistranslated and misappropriated here. And so we have to realize that if we are going to be people who try to represent the real gospel as Jesus gave it to us, the real gospel that Paul found himself in the presence of Christ uncondemned, if we want to talk about the love of God, the God who keeps no record of wrongs, the God who invites all into his presence to enjoy the love and the nurture of that love as they seek to struggle with what it means to live their lives. Learning to love each other, learning to live in love, learning to live loved, that it's important that you become a person who respects all the things that human literature has been trying to express to us. Now, today we live in a day where it's a lot easier for people to publish themselves. I mean, you can just publish stuff on Facebook, no matter who you are. And so that today all sorts of things can get published that include a lot more drivel than, say, would have been mass copied back in Paul's day. So I don't know that we can take the same advice here entirely to say read everything, because there's a lot of garbage out there, of course. But the general idea here was this, that there is a body of literature that is really advancing human insight and an understanding of who we are and what our condition is, and that this is something that Timothy is encouraged to move towards. And so my advice to those people who would be ministers of the gospel is that you become a person who is as educated as you can be. Respect the education and teachings of a wide variety of areas of interest. Don't just limit yourself to this biblical text as a resource for what it is you're dealing with, because a great deal of what we can know and understand about ourselves and apply in our position of faith, of living loved in the presence of a God who indwells each of us, is something that can be enhanced and brought to greater light by having a true respect for well educated, well expressed ideas and opinions and being open to it. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why I enjoy being a part of the New Covenant group, because we're not necessarily committed to any set of fixed ideas. We want to hear all of the ideas that are being expressed so that they can be considered. That doesn't mean we're fall for anything or that we'll just believe anything anybody says or think is awesome and wonderful. That's not true. But it does mean that we want to be involved in that dialogue. We want to be involved in reaching out to the various things that are asserted to have been observed, asserted to have been understood, things that people have been so compelled to write because they felt it would be useful to others. And they have such a motive coming upon them to write such things because they do care about the well-being of others. And that is the image of God within them. And that is why what they write is what we could call God-breathed. And so I see in this section here from 2 Timothy some very astute insight from Paul to his student here, Timothy, telling him what it is he's going to be up against. And that is what we're up against. Don't you see it? Don't you see this we've talked about things on the new, you here at the place and in the New Covenant group, here at the NCG studios. We talked about, is church harmful? We've looked at various things, various questions. We feel, I think, that we need to be honest about the fact that religion doesn't have a good record. Christianity doesn't have a good record. Christianity is one of the problems we've had to run into. And this is unfortunate because even the message of Jesus is corrupted and complicated by all of the things in history that have come down from people who really didn't have the love of and the best interests of others in mind. They saw Christianity and its theology as an opportunity to take control of people, to abuse them, to own them, to put them into a place that brought the leadership power. I'm telling you something. If it's true that Jesus is there, if it's true that you don't need a priest, if it's true that you have direct access to God, then we all come to this problem and question as equals. And if there's anything we can share with each other that we find useful, we can just put it on the table and work with it. But the moment we attempt to take control of each other and to take control of each other's spirituality is the moment we're violating something here that is very central to the real message of Jesus and the kind of character that Jesus showed us that he was. And I think that Paul is also doing something very similar to what Jesus did. When Jesus came, the only people he really had a serious problem with were the religious jerks, the adamant, dogmatic people who were really doing nothing but trying to take control of people. And people, some of them that they were taking control of, were people who really just gullibly worried about some of the situations and circumstances that they were in as to how God would feel about it. And they're being taken advantage of there. So just as Jesus opposed this kind of religiosity and its blindness and its abuses, so Paul sees this coming to the message of Jesus and warns Timothy about it, asking him to be on the lookout for it. And he gives him a strategy. And the strategy is read everything you can, find usefulness in it, and respect and uphold and applaud all of the good things that people have to say, no matter what the source is, no matter where it comes from, because the temple writings aren't the only useful documents. All literature is really very useful for these purposes. And of course, there's varied use in all of it, just as I think there's varied usefulness in the biblical text itself. But in a sense, part of what Paul says here, without actually explicitly saying it, he says to Timothy, really, in a sense, you're going to have to take responsibility for this yourself. This isn't the kind of thing where you can claim you have God's authority on this. You're going to have to struggle through these issues yourself. You're going to have to read these things for yourself. You're going to have to understand them for yourself. You're going to have to apply them for yourself and to the benefit of the people you administer to. And so that's a high calling. That's a difficult calling, and particularly in light of all of the obstacles you're going to run into. And I got to be honest with you, I find that in my own life, the biggest obstacles that I find are some of the more adamant and dogmatic religious concepts out there that are either being slammed down and out by people who are trying to take control, or are being held on to people who are fearful to let go of them because they're not so sure that their soul is going to be in good with God if they begin to think any differently than the way they've been told, which tells me they've already bought it hook, line, and sinker in a very abusive way. I'd like to see them, freed from that kind of abuse. Well, that's pretty much all I think that I can have about is speaking this message. But this is where I see Paul as having come from. And so I guess we're going to end up a few minutes early, unless you do have any comments or questions. Joey, is there any other comments that you might want to add on, or even if you guys can think of something down there in the studio to give to me? Your comment. Paul's dialogue there does sound spookily reminiscent of today's pastors. I totally agree with that comment, and I would tell you this. I'm ashamed to admit it, but like Paul, who ran around trying to kill Christians, in a similar, I wasn't going around trying to kill Christians, but I'll tell you what, I was one of those fundamentalists running around doing that, and I feel. In some ways, I feel embarrassed to realize that that's how foolish I was and how abusive I was. And I feel badly about that. It's done. It's what we did. Anyhow, so if you can come up with any other comments, I'll wait. I've kind of talked about this. I could go through it and review, but I don't feel a need to do that. But anyway, I'll wait here for other comments. Let me just say this. I've enjoyed the opportunity to do these shows. And in saying that, I mean, I want you to know that I take responsibility for the things that I'm saying. These are the things that make sense to me. And they come to you with no authority other than the fact that I'm just some guy who has tried his best to educate himself and to be educated by others and to take advantage of the things that are out there, and then simply come to this phenomenon of Jesus and of the text, and to just be honest with it and what it's saying and what it's doing and how it operates in our lives. And that's really where this comes from. As a result, it's just me. And if you find what I have to say useful, that's great. If you don't find it useful, then find something else that you do find more useful. But I would also encourage you, take responsibility for what it is you finally find and what it is you finally decide on and where it is you settle. Having said that, I think that we'll just wrap it up here. And so that's it. I'm Bob Greaves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share with you tonight. And we'll see you again in the future. Take care.
Stay with us in just a moment. Dr. Jones and his lovely wife Rhonda will be on the stage speaking with special guest Joshua Tongol. If you don't know who he is yet, you will not forget him by the time the show is over. It's going to be a tremendous discussion. So don't miss out, because I don't want you to cry. It'll be up in just a moment. Stay tuned.